يجب أن يستقيل في الساعات القادمة 20 أكتوبر 2004.
English newscast on Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are today's top stories. Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri stresses that the issue of the kidnapped servicemen concerns all the Lebanese and notes that the latest updates seem to be positive. Lebanese authorities arrest a Ba'ath Party cell allegedly involved in handing over Syrian rebels to Bashar al-Assad's regime after kidnapping them in Lebanon. And 8 dead children and a woman suffering from stab wounds are found inside a home in a northern Australian city. Future movement leaders, including former Prime Minister MP Fuad Sanyura and Interior Minister Nuhad al-Mashnouk, have returned from Saudi Arabia, where they held talks with party leader Saad Hariri ahead of the upcoming dialogue with Hezbollah. The national news agency says the future delegation, which also included former MPs Ghattas Houri and Bassem Sabah, returned to Beirut aboard a private jet early this morning. Future Justice Minister Ashraf Rifi had returned the day before to attend Thursday's cabinet meeting. The proposed dialogue between Future and Hezbollah will be primarily aimed at easing sectarian tensions exacerbated by the raging conflict in Syria and finding a way out of the presidential deadlock. ISIS is holding former Prime Minister Saad Hariri, MP Walid Jumblat, and Lebanese Forces leader Samir Jaja responsible for the lives of the 25 Lebanese hostages. In a recent video released online, the jihadi group accused the 3 politicians of committing a crime by cooperating with Hezbollah and turning the Lebanese army into a puppet in Hezbollah's hands, targeting the Sunni people through them. In the video, which was handed over to Tripoli Sheikh Wissam Masri, the militant flanked by captors holding knives to the necks of 3 of the Lebanese hostages, said ISIS was at a state of war with Hezbollah, which meddles in Syrian Muslim affairs and which has killed women and children. Addressing Hariri, Jumblat and Jaja, the militant said they were solely responsible for the future of their fellow citizen hostages and that their fate was in their hands. Masri, who claims he has been appointed as a mediator by militants holding the Lebanese servicemen, said he checked on the hostages held on the outskirts of the northeastern border village of Arsal. Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri has stressed that the issue of the kidnapped servicemen concerns all the Lebanese, noting that the latest updates seem to be positive. During a meeting with a delegation of the families of the military captives in Ain Tine, Berri said every Lebanese is concerned with the case. The House Speaker stressed that a hostage swap with the militants was on the table, adding that he is coordinating with MP Walid Jumblat in this regard. Separately, Berri has called for an inquiry as to why Washington halted its mission to resolve the dispute between Israel and Lebanon over the exclusive economic zone. Berri has reportedly tasked Lebanon's ambassador to Washington, Antoine Jdid, to find out why Amos Hochstein, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy, has stopped visiting the country since April. The Speaker said he would stress during a meeting with UNIFIL Commander Major General Luciano Portolano the role the UN and peacekeepers should play in helping Lebanon preserve its rights to its exclusive economic zone for exploiting maritime reserves. Lebanon and Israel are at loggerheads over 870 kilometers in the southern territorial waters. Lebanon insists this disputed zone is part of the Lebanese territorial waters and it is not willing to concede a single kilometer to Israel. Berri said earlier this month that he had evidence Israel had begun stealing from Lebanon's offshore gas wealth. Lebanese authorities have arrested a Ba'ath Party cell allegedly involved in handing over Syrian rebels to Bashar al-Assad's regime after kidnapping them in Lebanon. Security sources say that the all-Lebanese 7-member cell was arrested in Kfar in the southeastern province of Hasbaya earlier this week. The cell was said to have kidnapped a number of Syrian rebels before handing them over to the Syrian government. The sources said one group member, identified as Haytham Hamad, was wounded during the raid carried out by the Internal Security Forces Information Branch. He was reportedly taken to a local hospital and kept under strict watch by the police. The sources added that the group's leader, Majid Mansour, was among the detainees, some of whom hail from the Bika village of Gaza. The cell has been in close contact with Ali Deeb, who was an official of the intelligence branch of Syria's Ba'ath Party during the era of the Syrian occupation. The sources said Mansour's cell had been operating closely with Hezbollah's resistance brigades. Financial prosecutor Judge Ali Ibrahim has filed charges of embezzlement of public funds and bribery against a police officer and the owner of a fuel company for overcharging the government for diesel. This is according to the national news agency, which says Al Shahra Petroleum Company's owner and an officer from the Internal Security Forces were accused of overbilling the ISF Directorate and Rafiq Hariri University Hospital for supplying diesel. Health Minister Wael Abu Faour had filed a complaint with the financial prosecutor earlier this week, asking him to investigate the wider files related to the fuel company, which is owned by Hussein Haloum. In addition to Rafiq Hariri University Hospital, 6 other public health facilities were allegedly shortchanged. Abu Faour ordered the hospitals to stop paying the company until the judiciary made a decision on the accusations. Maronite Patriarch Bishara Da'i has called on church court officials to ensure that cases are being processed quickly, efficiently and without extra cost, citing complaints by the public about red tape, delays and high cost of church transactions. The Da'i pointed out that in order to speed up case processing, the Maronite Church had imposed additional working days on judges in the church's regular courts and appellate courts. He said the church decided to put up price lists of court fees for the different services, stressing that lawyers' fees were totally separate. The prelate deplored the growing number of divorce cases handled by the church, calling on the court judges to refer troubled couples to marriage counseling centers set up by the church in the various parishes. Well, coming up next, U.S. President Barack Obama expresses concern over mass trials and the continued detention of journalists and activists in Egypt. More after the break. Welcome back. Kurdish Peshmerga fighters have fought their way to Iraq's Sinjar mountains, where hundreds of people have been trapped for months by fighters of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant Group. The assault, backed by U.S.-led airstrikes, ended the months-long ordeal of hundreds of people from Iraq's Yazdi minority who had been besieged on the mountain since ISIL stormed Sinjar and other Kurdish-controlled parts of northern Iraq in August. Sources say all the Yazidis that were trapped on the mountain are now free, but the Peshmerga had not yet begun to evacuate them. Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers began their offensive on Wednesday to break the Sunni armed group's siege of the mountain and the town of Sinjar. 100 ISIL fighters have reportedly been killed. Army Lieutenant General James Terry, the general in command of U.S. forces involved in the fight against Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria, says he thought it would take a minimum of 3 years to achieve a turning point against the group. Asked at a Pentagon briefing about progress on the ground, Terry said the first U.S. airstrikes had taken place only 4 months ago and counseled patience.
I think we've made significant progress in halting that offensive that I talked about, the ability for them to continue to expand, in terms of terrain and geography out there. I think what we must do, especially inside of Iraq, is continue to build those capabilities. I think you're at least talking a minimum of 3 years. Now that doesn't mean we haven't started turning Daesh in a certain direction, and that's going to be the power of the coalition, not only from a military perspective, but how do you apply all those elements of national power along from the different nations along those lines of effort that have been laid out there. So I hesitate to give you a time, because I'll show up in 6 months and you'll ask me why we haven't gotten there. I think a lot of it, I see the conditions for right now being set for a pretty stable environment, but I still think we're, in terms of building some of the capabilities that are required there, probably about 3 years down the road minimum.
U.S. President Barack Obama spoke to his Egyptian counterpart Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and expressed concern over mass trials and the continued detention of journalists and peaceful activists. During a telephone call, Obama reportedly encouraged Sisi to invest in the political, economic and social aspirations of the Egyptian people. A White House statement says President Obama also expressed concern about mass trials, the status of NGOs and the continued imprisonment of journalists and peaceful activists in Egypt. In early December, an Egyptian court sentenced 188 people to death for the murder of 13 police officers, the latest in a series of mass trials launched by authorities amid a crackdown on supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi. During Thursday's telephone call, Obama emphasized the importance of cooperation between Washington and Cairo to promote shared interests in counterterrorism and regional security. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has welcomed the recent release of a number of detainees in Cuba and the United States, some of whose cases have been followed by expert group. The release was announced after moves to normalize relations between the two countries were unveiled earlier this week.
One would hope there would be some, really major developments on the human rights front now that, assuming it all goes ahead, now that this kind of deadlock is broken, and we would hope to see some really beneficial effects on human rights, including ratification of treaties, and of course implementation of those treaties as well. So possibly some major implications, hopefully all beneficial. Clearly the blockade against Cuba has affected the average Cuban in a significant way for many, many years. So it would be good to see a normalization, and then, if human rights issues remain in terms of, suppression of fundamental freedoms, obviously we would raise those, and so would NGOs, and so would governments. So that it normalize the situation just like any other state, where there are issues in every state. But we can work with them. But I think to unblock the situation can only be healthy. I think, like most other people, very happy about the developments this week in relations between the US and Cuba, and particularly about the releases of the last three members of the so-called Cuban Five, and also of Alan Gross. And in both those cases, the Cuban Five and Gross, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention had qualified their detention as arbitrary.
Moving on to Australia, 8 dead children and a woman suffering from stab wounds have been found inside a home in a northern city. Police believe the 34-year-old woman with chest wounds is the mother of 7 of the children, and the 8th child is believed to be one of her relatives. She was receiving treatment for her injuries and was in stable condition at a hospital. Queensland State Police said they were called to the home of the Cairns suburb of Manoora this morning after receiving a report of a woman with serious injuries. When police got to the house, they found the bodies of the children inside, ranging in age from 18 months old to 15 years. And back in Europe, a demonstration against Spain's new anti-protest bill will be held tomorrow following its approval by the conservative-led Spanish parliament on December 11th. Despite heavy opposition from some politicians and activist groups who say the law violates the right to protest, limits freedom of expression and gives more power to police, the bill will go to the Senate next, where it is expected to pass. A ruling People's Party also has a majority in the upper house. The measure essentially limits demonstrations to authorized gatherings and imposes heavy fines on unauthorized protesters. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. Parliament Speaker Nabil Berri stresses that the issue of the kidnapped servicemen concerns all the Lebanese and notes that the latest updates seem to be positive. Lebanese authorities arrest a Ba'ath Party cell allegedly involved in handing over Syrian rebels to Bashar al-Assad's regime after kidnapping them in Lebanon. And finally, 8 dead children and a woman suffering from stab wounds are found inside a home in a northern Australian city. Those are your Friday headlines from us here at Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, wishing you all a very nice weekend.
يجب أن يستقيل في الساعات القادمة 20 أكتوبر 2020.